Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon for those watching in North America. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. I'm in charge of English language events and programming here at the center. And we have a number of in-person and on Zoom events, usually discussing either contemporary political or security issues here in Israel, the Middle East, or in the wider Jewish world, or sometimes historical issues as well. And I should say about the event that we have planned for you this evening, in many ways, I think it's representative of how fast-moving things are in this part of the world. This event was originally scheduled for July, and then for unforeseen circumstances, we had to postpone it. But then when it was planned, this was just after the war with Iran, and I thought that's going to be the main focus of the talk. And then we rescheduled for October. And when we originally advertised it some weeks ago, there were various things going on. The military operation had begun in Gaza City. And then, of course, last week we had the news that knocked all the other news out of the park in terms of its momentous nature and the historic nature of it. And I think we have a lot to talk about 2 years on from October 7th. There's going to be a lot talked about and written about, not just that day, but of course many things that have happened since. And I imagine the last 2 weeks is going to be talked about and written about a lot in the future. And I think as more things come to light, and we're going to discover more about the motivations and what happened in behind-the-scenes conversations, and all these kinds of revelations will come out. But for now, there's a lot of commentary and analysis, and we have with us today really someone that I've personally learned a lot from and enjoy reading and listening to, Dan Feferman, who is the co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of Middle East 24, which is a new Middle East media initiative, and we'll hear about that later. He was previously executive director of Sharaka, where he now serves as a co-chair. Some of you may remember hearing Dan talk about Sharaka on a webinar that I did with him some years ago. But it's a really amazing initiative building on the Abraham Accords and the sort of people-to-people encounters between Israelis and Arabs. Dan was also is a major in the Israeli Defense Forces, a reservist. In fact, I just heard he's going back into service tomorrow at some unearthly hour. He served as a foreign policy and national security analyst and intelligence officer specializing in Middle East affairs. He has a BA in international politics and Middle East studies from American University and an MA in security studies from Tel Aviv University. We're going to hear from Dan. I'm going to have a conversation with him and then open the floor to questions from you. Dan Feferman.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Paul. Thank you to the Begin Heritage Center. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you said, we were originally planning on doing it in July, and my parents were supposed to be here then. They had to cancel their trip. Thankfully, they also happened to reschedule the trip, so I'm glad they're here visiting from the United States. Maybe it's also fortuitous that we delayed until now because, for the last 2 years, this country, I think every single person in it and most of the Jewish world and many around the world have been directly, indirectly involved in this war, whether in the army, on the front lines, families of, and glued to the screens following what was the most horrific terror attack in our history, one of the most horrific terror attacks in history, and of course, the 2-year war that ensued. And the roller coaster of events, developments, emotions, the terror, the regrouping of course, and one of the most consequential and brutal wars that we here in Israel have had to fight. And I believe the achievements of that war, fight a war against virtually all of our enemies at once. I mean, this is something unheard of in international terms. And the losses, the sacrifices, the achievements of it are absolutely profound. And I think we need to speak in terms of watershed moments for Israel, for the region, and that has significant effect on international affairs that we're going to unpack. One of my contentions these last 2 years is that one can't understand October 7th and this war, and now we have to talk about the Trump-brokered peace plan, without understanding the other watershed moment that happened just over 5 years ago, 5 years and a month ago, and that's the Abraham Accords, coincidentally or not, brokered by the same administration, by the same president. And what I'm essentially claiming is that the October 7th attack and the war that ensued, that has so drastically reshaped the region, must be understood in the context of the Abraham Accords, and I urge you, I suggest you to see them as flip sides of the same coin. And the framework that I developed to talk about this and to try to understand this in recent years has been one that I call the builders and the destroyers. And I think this is the most useful framework that I can offer to try to understand what's happening in the current and modern Middle East. I'm going to try something to pack all of this in under 20 minutes, as Paul gave me the assignment, and that is going to be a feat maybe even more challenging than achieving Middle East peace. For anyone who's known me before, I like to talk. So let's start with a few minutes on the Abraham Accords. Of course, we're talking about the phenomenal agreements. They might have seemed small. They might be with the actual physical geographic outliers on one side of the Middle East, on the other side of North Africa, announced in August of 2020, signed in September, of course, between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and then later on with the smaller kingdom of Bahrain, and we'll tack onto that and almost an asterisk with Sudan, and of course with the Kingdom of Morocco in December of 2020. And this was huge. This was huge because it broke the longest held taboo of Middle Eastern politics. You don't talk to the Israelis, you don't deal with the Israelis. You certainly, if you have to sign a peace agreement with them, you keep it cold and you don't normalize relations between the Israelis. I was fortunate enough to be among a group of young kind of Israeli influencers, writers, business people, culture people who hopped onto this train early and began networking. And then, of course, I used my American passport and I flew out to the UAE before all the hundreds of thousands of Israelis did so. And mind you, I'm supposed to be a Middle East affairs expert, and I really couldn't believe my eyes. And I'll give you just the first 3 examples that I saw within the first couple hours of landing in the UAE. And the first one is the billboard that I see on the way from the airport to the hotel. It was for an auto commercial. You can see maybe where I'm going when we think about the Middle East, especially the hyper-conservative Gulf Arab states. And in 2 of the 3 billboards for this same car company, you have not only women drivers, but most of them are dressed in Western modern attire. Okay, and I noticed that immediately. I don't know how many people pay attention to billboards as you're driving, but as I came to learn over the next 15 trips to the Gulf, nothing is accident, everything is symbolic, everything is meant to communicate something, either to the people who live there or to the people who are visiting. The next thing I see, I go for a walk, it's quite late at night, and I see a jogger, a female jogger in a sports bra and shorts, and I said, did I land in the right country here, right? This is not what I expected to see at 2 o'clock in the morning in an Arab country, an Arab Muslim country. And then, of course, as I'm walking down the promenade, I see none other than a cheesecake factory. Those of you who have been to the United States know what that chain of restaurants is. And you see 2 Arabian men in full Arabian gowns, attire, sitting there and smoking a hookah pipe, a shisha, at a cheesecake factory in Dubai. I understood that this place is not what I imagined. And over the course of the next week and then 14 more weeks, more or less, that I visited and talked to people from quite literally all over the Arab and Muslim world, I understood that the UAE is the sort of the New York, if you will, of of the Arab world meets South Asia meets East Africa, I understood something else was happening there, and I began to try to unpack it. And if my original intention was to try to bridge business deals between Israel and the Gulf, I realized I'm much better at being a speaker than I am at bridging business deals. And so I pivoted to part of what you're hearing now. And I want to try to quickly unpack the significance of these accords. Over the next few years and in the course of Sharaka, the NGO that I used to run and had many, many speaking tours also all over the United States, we were asked a lot of questions. Isn't this just a business deal? Isn't this just another plan to build Trump hotels, right, in other parts of the world? Isn't this just an arms deal? Isn't this just all about Iran? And my answer to all of those was yes, 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 and yes. And of course, we must. You're in the Middle East. Two things can be true at once, and everything can be true at once. And even if things don't make sense, they can all be true at once. And so, yes, the strategic component against Iran has to be understood, has to be appreciated. And it has to be understood in the context of the president who initiated the accords and also the previous president. And this is not going where you think I'm going. So bear with me for 30 seconds while I open a parentheses here. You had, in the 8 years of the Obama administration, a new language, a new signaling, a new foreign policy doctrine that came out of Washington that signaled to everyone in the Middle East, certainly America's until then good friends and allies in the Arab Gulf states and in Israel, that guess what? You might not be at the top of America's list of priorities. The US doesn't see your relationship with America as important. America was starting to speak in a very different and warm, maybe even fuzzy language towards Iran and towards Islamists. And it was pulling away and giving a cold shoulder to the Saudis, to the Emiratis, to the Gulf states, and of course to us here in Israel. At the time, I was a military planner, and I remember the concern that we had in the system when we tried to understand where US, Israel, and US Middle East relations are going. The bottom line of that, there began to grow this understanding in many parts of the Middle East that maybe the US cannot be counted on when push comes to shove. Jump forward a few years, and then you have President Trump, of course, the most pro-Israel president in the history of the United States, who also came with a mantra of America first. And America first said that America comes first, and that the Iraq wars and the Afghanistan wars didn't go so well for the Americans. And so Americans on the left and on the right began very seriously questioning, should the United States start becoming involved in unnecessary Middle Eastern conflicts that drag down America into years and years of war and $1 trillion and thousands of dead soldiers that eventually don't lead to democracy in the Middle East. And so you had two consecutive presidents on the left and on the right that told people in the Middle East that if you are attacked by Iran or by ISIS at the time, that was the hit of the Middle East, America might not come to your aid. And who is the one country in the Middle East that not only has the capability, but also the resolve to go after Iran and its proxies? Israel, of course. We jump over into economics. These are countries that are based on fossil fuels, on oil, especially on gas in the case of the Qataris. And they're also understanding that at some point in their economic trajectory, the fossil fuels, the oil money is going to run out. They need to diversify their economies. They can buy all the expertise and foreign technologies they want, but they want to develop their own innovation ecosystems. And who is the engine of innovation in the Middle East? Very good, you're 2 for 2. Let's see if we can get the third one. And these are countries that don't seem to have a lot of water or agricultural expertise, and they look around the region, and who's the one country that can handle water technologies and agriculture? Very good. And so for a whole host of both geopolitical, economic, and development reasons, it helps them, it behooves them. They start seeing Israel much more as a strategic asset than as a strategic burden. Mind you, these are countries that did have back doors, behind the scenes, positive relations with Israel for the better course of the last 2 decades. But there's something bigger at play that needs to be understood behind the Abraham Accords, and these are the deep shifts in the region. And I'm going to call it an awakening to the failed isms of the Middle East. Okay, the 2 isms that I'm referring to, of course, are pan-Arabism, Nasserism, right? The idea that if all the Arab countries kind of coalesce and form this grand army in the spirit of Salah ad-Din and reconquer Israel, Palestine, right, in their view, then all of their problems will be fixed, and they have to defeat this island of Western imperialism in their midst. And who is the island of Western imperialism in their midst? Let's go 4 for 4. You guys are good. Okay. And of course, over the years, Saddam Hussein was one of the last of the pan-Arabists. Of course, Bashar Assad pretended to be one of these last secular leaders, influenced both by the Marxists in an anti-West kind of ideology, but also ironically influenced by Nazi ideologies as regards Israel and the Jews. And in the 1990s, of course, you had an upsurge of Islamism, this new, very violent, militaristic, politicized notion of a radical fundamentalist Islam. If only all the Muslims essentially, chozrim b'tshuva, right? If they just all become from again, then all of the problems of the Middle East and of the Arab and Muslim world will be solved. And in order to prove that their cause is righteous, they have to defeat, of course. You guys are good. You guys are good. Have you heard this one before? And there's a realization, a very strong realization in many, many parts of the Arab world, and especially if you talk to people behind closed doors, that they understand that these isms haven't helped anybody. They've dragged the Arab world and the Muslim world backwards, if anything. Israel keeps getting stronger and stronger militarily and economically. Israel's GDP per capita and Iran's GDP per capita were roughly equal back in the 1970s. Look where we are today. They've actually remained at about, the number is in the few thousands of dollars a year, and we're ahead of most of the OECD countries at an over $50,000 a year per capita GDP. And every single country in the Arab world pays attention to this and understands it. But there's a deeper issue at play here, and they understand that the Palestine issue has been hijacked. It's certainly been abandoned by the pan-Arabists. The pan-Arabists are really not a force in Arab politics anymore. The Islamists, however, still are, and the Islamist cause has been picked up by none other than the Islamic Republic of Iran. Don't be confused that they are Shia and the rest of the Muslim Brotherhood is Sunni. They know how to cooperate very well when it comes to defeating. Good. You see a theme here. And they understand that this cause has been hijacked by Iran, by Iran's proxy armies, by the Muslim Brotherhood, and used to distract, to avoid any kind of reforms within their own societies. And it's tied to this thematic, maybe civilizational kind of attitude of victim mentality and scapegoating. And something new and interesting is happening in these parts of the Arab world. I heard for the first time from a number of thinkers and writers and speakers two terms that I'd never heard before in all my years of studying the Middle East. It's not Israel, don't worry, I'm not going to call it. National self-interest. National self-interest. Because the pan-Arabists certainly didn't speak of national self-interest, and the Islamists also don't speak of national self-interest. They're not interested in countries. They're interested in reestablishing the caliphate. So how can you speak of national self-interest? And what happens when the national self-interest of the Emiratis or the Bahrainis or the Moroccans or the Saudis goes against that of the Palestinians or the Lebanese or certainly the Iranians? And what I began to joke with my friends and develop a framework is that we're seeing something new in the Arab world. And I started to call my friends Arab Zionists. They like that joke. I promise you, they like that joke. And my point to them was understanding Zionism, right, in the Jewish story, in the Jewish narrative, as a reclaiming of agency. And the way you reclaim agency is through sovereignty, certainly in our world today. And what you had for the first time was a positive, pragmatic, forward-looking mentality developing in the heart of the Arab world. And I began to term them builders. Builders, not just because there's actual construction cranes absolutely everywhere you go, but that's the mindset. It's how do we build our societies, our economies, our education systems, our technologies. And they realized and they understand that if, in order to attract business and tourism and talented foreigners that they need both the white collar and the blue collar workers, you have to have a welcoming, tolerant, pluralistic, dare I say, society. You have to have property rights. You have to have a relative lack of corruption. You have to have rule of law. You have to have thriving and attractive economies and societies. It's something that I started seeing in the UAE. And mind you, this is my take on the UAE. They are the R&D lab of the Arab and Muslim world. So what you see there that's succeeding, everyone else who has any kind of competency will try to emulate them with a delay of 10 or 20 years, and they might not be able to implement it as well, but that is the trend line that I see in that part of the Arab world. And something that I never expected to see in the Arab world is they are looking for win-wins. And much of the culture of the Arab world, the tribal warfare, the sectarian warfare that has plagued this region for so long, is because the Middle Eastern mindset has often been a cut off your nose to spite your face mentality. And we see it here very much in our own country, oftentimes in our own politics, I have to say, as we have become maybe more Middle Eastern than we like to admit. But you're not seeing that with this new builder mentality. It's how do we create win-wins? And what they need is regional integration of everybody, including Israel. They need to defeat radicalism, not for our sake, but for their own sake, because it's a destabilizing force for their own societies. And it's very hard to do business and make money when you have regional wars and you have radicalism. And they realize that they have to neutralize, sideline, quiet, and one day brush aside or solve elegantly the Palestinian issue, the monkey in the room of Middle Eastern politics, because it has been hijacked by the extremists. Now, how do you do this shift if what you have done or allowed to be done for 7 decades is demonize Israel and create this legal and social taboo on anyone daring to normalize? We call them normalization agreements. I'm not familiar with any other conflict where the governments are in conflict and the peoples are not allowed to even talk to each other. Even between the Gulf states, excuse me, who view the Islamic Republic of Iran as their mortal enemy, you see Iranians going back and forth to the Gulf and doing business deals nonstop. And it never stopped at any point of any of the tensions between the two countries. And so you saw a gradual process of normalizing the concept of Jews, of Israel, of soft relations with Israel, of sports delegations, and so on and so on and so on, to build up to the Abraham Accords, and we have a long way to go. This war put a big hurdle and maybe took us back on the popular front. I'll come back to the government level on that. But something incredible that they also had to do was clamp down on radical Islam and radicalism in their own societies. So they actually clamped down and arrested all of the instigators, Muslim Brotherhood, Iranian agents, you name it, in their own societies. But they also went at the education systems and the mosque systems and infrastructure. And what you see there that has been working, and this is what gives me a lot of hope for the region, is they replaced Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islam with something that very, very much speaks of a moderate Islam. And I might dare say that what they're trying to do, without saying what they're trying to do, they don't have a name for it, is similar to what we saw in every kind of enlightenment and reformation process that we saw in Judaism and Christianity and other religions over the years. What we might be seeing is the introduction of something that could be called a reform Islam, right? Or the modern Orthodox version of Islam, however you want to accept that. And they don't have that terminology yet, but this is what you're seeing in practice, not just in the UAE, but in other parts of the Muslim world. And you needed a president, like him or not, like President Trump, like his team, who didn't read apparently any of the diplomacy and history books, because every single administration prior to him, Democrat and Republican, went on the same paradigm, the same formula. You cannot have peace in the Middle East until you solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to the point where if you ask most people around the world, what is the Middle East conflict, people will tell you, and, yeah, right? Except there are dozens of conflicts around the Middle East that have nothing to do with Israel or the Palestinians. There's a conflict within the Palestinians that has nothing to do with Israel. And you needed to break that paradigm. And it takes time to break that paradigm. And you needed a president like Trump, a big FU president, okay, who was willing to do that and not look at the the obsession that every administration and every other government in the world still, to a large extent, has. And so the Gulf Arabs, hyper pragmatic, very educated Gulf Arabs, they also understand, and the language I hear behind the scenes, I'm taking more than the 20 minutes, but you'll forgive me here, is you're talking about a mentality that is, frankly, and again, I'm paraphrasing dozens and dozens of conversations. They're sick of the entitlement. They're sick of the victimhood mentality that they're seeing from the Palestinians. They understand, and they're becoming, obviously, as they travel the world, as they get out of their own media ecosystems and bubbles, they study at the best universities in the world. They, God forbid, meet Jews and realize that most of us are quite nice, actually. And they understand something that has dawned on them. The Palestinians have rejected multiple peace offers. The Palestinians have had multiple opportunities to raise themselves up, to become builders. And there's something stuck in the mentality, not just Hamas, but the broad-speaking mentality of Palestinian society and government and politics. And then they started asking, this was about a decade and a bit ago, they started asking Palestinian leaders, we've given you hundreds of billions of dollars over the last decades. Where is it? Or one of my good friends, a former government advisor in the Gulf, said, we want to see the receipts. And what they see is that almost all of this money has been embezzled, either to personal corruption and bank accounts or to the shocking terrorist infrastructure that we discovered the last 2 years inside of Gaza. And not only did they get this sense of ingratitude and entitlement from their brothers, the Palestinians, but the Palestinians then turned to their mortal neighbor across the Gulf, the Iranians, and got into bed with them. And so what you're seeing is a frustration. What you're seeing is a sense of, what's the word I'm looking for? Help me out here. Frustration, deep, deep, deep frustration with the Palestinians that goes against all of their entire builder mentality, because they want to see winners, they want to see builders, they want to see agency, they want to see people taking their own destiny into their own hands. And so that's what I began to term this, and this is what I urge you to look at, the new fault line of the Middle East. I talked about the builders, I'm going to get now to the destroyers. The new fault line that I think best helps us understand the new Middle East, it's not Sunni and Shia, because I think we're going to see some dramatic movements on that front. It's not the monarchies versus the Arabists. It's not the republics versus the monarchies. I don't even think it's the pro-West versus the anti-West. The Soviet Union's gone. I think what we're going to see now is this split along the lines of builders, a change, a deep change in mentality of those who are seeking pragmatic, forward-looking solutions to the region, which requires regional integration, which requires Israel, of course, to play a key role in that. And I'm going to end the Abraham Accords chapter of this with saying that the Abraham Accords in one way can be looked at an elegant, grand package of branding or rebranding for these countries together with the United States to unwind, to detangle, to uncomplicate the useless, in their view, Arab-Israeli conflict, the Arab-Palestinian conflict, and a way to really sideline the radicals in the region. And now I'm going to jump to October 7th. October 7th occurred just about 3 years after the signing of the Abraham Accords. There was a huge swing in positive momentum in the region. And of course, I'm not going to dive into October 7th. I'm going to get to where my mind was a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later as we began to try to digest the shock and the horror of what we were all witnessing and seeing and experiencing. And I had 4 big questions. Who is Hamas? And what are their goals? Why October 7th? Why the timing? What did they think they were going to achieve? And how could we, the state of Israel, the government of Israel, my former military intelligence, and the Mossad and the Shabak, how could we let this happen? So those are the 4 big questions I tried to ask myself. So I think first, this is something that I've been saying on every lecture I've given around the world, and shockingly enough, Israel was rudely awakened to this answer, but most in the world outside of the Middle East seem to still not understand this. We have to understand Hamas as an organization wearing 2 hats. One as the most hawkish rejectionist element of the Palestinian militant resistance groups. That's its name, Harakat Muqawama. Muqawama means resistance. By the way, Muqawama al-Islamiyya, Hamas. Harakat Muqawama al-Islamiyya. What word didn't you hear in there? The Islamic resistance movement. What word didn't I say? I didn't say Palestinian. I never said the word Palestinian. Because the other hat, and the more important hat that Hamas wears, is that it is the Palestinian branch, the Palestinian representative of Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. And the Muslim Brotherhood has a much bigger agenda. It is regional and eventually global dominance. The more I dive into Muslim Brotherhood, the more I kind of joked, but I realized how correct I was, that they take the protocols of the elders of Zion and they see it as a playbook. And if you dive deep into how they actually operate around the world, it is shockingly similar to the fake anti-Semitic masterpiece, the protocols of the elders of Zion. And they are the Palestinian member of Muslim Brotherhood. And we have to understand that their goal is certainly not a peace with Israel, although they know how to manipulate that language. It is not even a liberation of Palestine in their view. The defeat of Israel, of Zionism, of the Jews is a step towards regional conquest and the reestablishment of a global caliphate. Two, why October 7th? Why the timing of the attack? So we know, first of all, it happened on Simchat Torah. We know that if there's not an imminent threat, Israeli military bases are, people go home for the weekend. They go home to be with their families. But there's two more important points. One is that they understood, correctly so, that in late 2023, early 2024, we were on the cusp of a historic grand bargain peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And this I've seen verified now, both on the intentions of the Americans and the Saudis and the Israelis, that this was quite likely going to happen. And we know actually from documents found in Gaza that this was actually part of their thought process. And if the Abraham Accords, part one, was meant to unwind and begin the process of ending the Israeli-Arab conflict, then an agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia will be the full end of the Israeli-Arab Jewish-Muslim conflict in this region as we know it. And they understood that. And they understood that they're going to be out of a job, and that with the tacit blessings of their overlords in Iran, they launched this attack in order to torpedo these accords, in order to torpedo the peace. But of course, what was the third part of that? Is what was happening here on October 6th. The judicial protests and counter-protests and counter-protests. And either whether you live here in Israel or you're watching from abroad, and believe me, Yahya Sinwar watched Israeli society very, very closely. They saw a society on the brink of collapse, a society that cannot stand on its own legs. And it needs this one final push in order to bring down this house of cards of European colonialists. And what happens when you strike at a European colonialist hard enough? They go back to Europe, right? That's what happened to the French in Algeria, of course. And that's why the timing of this attack, and of course, what did they think they were going to achieve? At the maximum, those like Yahya Sinwar, the true radicals among the radicals, actually believed that they would be able to instigate a full regional war to get Hezbollah and Syria and the Iranian militias in Iraq and the Iranians and the Houthis and the West Bank Palestinians and even Israeli Arabs to rise up, and this country of settlers that's fighting one another will finally collapse and they will achieve their victory. At the very least, they will bloody the enemy, they will embarrass the enemy, they will demoralize the enemy, and utilize their mastery, their manipulation of international media and social media, especially to turn Israel even more into an international pariah, to turn the West even more against Israel, maybe even to collapse the Abraham Accords. And so this is the time to hit go on the grand plan. And of course, the last question I had here was, how could we let this happen? So the short answer is hubris. We had hubris in the entire intelligence and decision-making system, and it's now starting to come out that we simply didn't take Hamas seriously. We pulled out our human intelligence sources from Gaza. We deprioritized Gaza. We prioritized Hezbollah. We prioritized Iran, but we lowered the intelligence assets and the focus on Hamas. We didn't take them seriously. Of course, Hamas employed a 2-3 year campaign of psychological deception to get us to believe that they're not a threat, that they are quite complacent in getting Qatari cash briefcases every month and letting workers into Israel. And maybe there was this delusion amongst most analysts in Israel, myself included, that they are becoming more moderate and enjoying the trappings of power, and that war with Israel was the last thing that they were seeking. However, what I realized that the bigger issue is that we had a failure of imagination. And the failure of imagination is what led to the intelligence failure. Yes, it was hubris, but it was also a failure of conception, of conceptia. We had a conceptual failure here. And for those of you who have not been in intelligence, I'll tell you in under 15 seconds exactly how the intelligence world works. You collect massive amounts of data and pictures and conversations and newspaper articles and chatter from thousands of different sources and satellites and social media and emails and phone calls. And then you have to make sense of it. And you don't know what's real or not, or what's relevant or not. And in order to guide that, you need to have a conception. You need to have, like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, you need the picture. Are you putting together a sailboat? Are you putting together a forest or dogs playing poker? And we had the wrong picture. Because if you have the wrong conceptia, you put together the wrong puzzle. And then all of the intelligence coming out of the bottom of the tatzpitaniyot, the surveillance soldiers on the border, saying, it looks like they're practicing for an invasion of kibbutzim, doesn't make sense to you because well, I have a picture of dogs and you're showing me sailboats, and it doesn't make sense. And the reason we had an imagination failure is because we are a society of builders. And a society of builders deep down cannot conceptualize the mindset of a destroyer. We don't know how to do it. We don't know what it means to say, I'm willing to sacrifice myself, my children, my neighbors, my entire city, my community, all for the sake of making you look bad and maybe getting the world to turn on you a little more. We don't know how to do that. We don't know how to imagine that. It should have been the job of the intelligence to say, we can't understand it, but that's their thinking. And that's where we had the failure on October 7th. Now, Hamas miscalculated drastically on almost every one of its gambits. First of all, Israeli society showed itself to be incredibly resilient. And I think that's one of the most unbelievable things of these last 2 years. Israeli Arab society did not rise up and behaved extremely responsible. West Bank Arabs, while we have seen a major uptick in terror, did not bring about a third intifada as they were expecting. Not a single Arab ambassador was recalled, and the government-to-government relations remain not only stable, but actually improved in many cases between Israel and the countries with which we have relations. Not even Jordan or Egypt pulled back their ambassadors. And the economic progress, the trade between Israel and the UAE actually grew during this time. Hezbollah overreached, and we all know what happened to Hezbollah, the pager operation, the magnificent 3-week military and intelligence campaign that decapitated the most powerful non-state military in the world, powerful than some state militaries here in the Middle East, Hassan Nasrallah. And we don't appreciate it enough in Israel, how much of a mythical figure of the resistance against Israel, against the West, was assassinated. You have people in Lebanon and Syria publicly thanking Israel and crowning Netanyahu for this achievement. I don't think it was appreciated enough here in Israel. Of course, the overreach led to Assad's downfall in Syria, and you have now politicians, major mainstream politicians in Lebanon, openly calling for peace with Israel. And you have advanced security talks, I'm not going to say quite peace, with Syria, talks between high-level figures in the new Syrian regime, which is backed by the Sunni powers and the United States and the UK, and the Gulf states in the region. We know the final strike on Iran, the tremendous operation, the 12-day war that exposed Iran as the absolute paper tiger it was, left its airspace completely defenseless for Israeli planes, took out 80% of its advanced ballistic missiles, and rolled back its nuclear program significantly by, some say, 2, 3, even 5 years, and significant damage and setback to the Houthis in Yemen. Hard to say they've been defeated. That's a bit more of a complex topic. The point is that the region today is unimaginable compared to where it was 2 years ago and even a year and a half ago. Completely unimaginable on a strategic level. Iran, the bully of the region, is not respected by any of the powers, and you have political dialogue, discourse, movement in almost all of the Middle East finally pushing back or throwing out or speaking out against Iranian involvement and influence or Iran-backed or Islamist parties in the region. Hamas, the last, and this is something that a guest on my podcast that's coming out now today pointed out, Hamas was the last of the Muslim Brotherhood armies, and it's essentially been defeated. Not fully, but essentially been defeated. Virtually all of Iran's proxy armies around the region have been defeated. And now the big question is, how do you turn military victories into strategic gains, political gains? And here comes the Trump plan where we find ourselves today. And the big challenge has always been, how do you end a war or wrap up this part of the war against a foe that refuses to accept surrender, refuses to be vanquished no matter how many losses they've taken or how bloodied they are. A foe that relies on our unwillingness to be as ruthless as they are and who manipulates both their strategy as a human shield, all of Gaza and all of Gazans as a human shield, and their masterful, really masterful manipulation of the media. And the Trump plan that was so interesting that we'll talk about in a second here, and I'll give you just the bottom line of it, the brilliance of it, is that for the first time that I can recall in regional politics and history, you managed to get the entire Arab world and every significant Muslim country, maybe except the Iranians, and including Hamas's main backers in Qatar and Turkey, all on the side of Israel. And this is the huge achievement of this plan. Make no mistake, Hamas did not agree to it. Hamas's agreement is tactical and meant to buy time. But the fact that for the first time, we now have virtually the entire region, certainly every significant actor in the region, on Israel's side of this agreement, gives me hope that we can use this to go forward in a very fruitful way and achieve, I don't want to say peace, I don't think we can ever talk in terms of peace here in the region, but in terms of calm, in terms of regional integration, in terms of the next steps, Abraham Accords 2.0 of the region. And so on that front, I'm quite actually optimistic. I'll say, and I'll end on this and we'll go to our conversation. And I'm sorry to kind of end this part on a downer, but the one part of Hamas's plan that actually worked, and that should give us all a lot of concern, is how Hamas, as part of Muslim Brotherhood, backed by Qatar, backed by Iran, backed by Turkey, backed by the Chinese and the Russians, managed to shift, I don't want to say half, but a significant portion of Western and global public opinion against Israel, against the Jews, and against the concept of the West, of democracy, of capitalism itself, to the point where you're about to see one of the biggest Jewish cities in the world, in the heart of global finance, possibly elect a openly anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and anti-capitalism mayor. And I will stop there for now, and we can continue in the conversation.
Okay, Dan, thank you very much. Despite your American accent, I can see how Israeli you are, because that was a very Israeli 20 minutes.
So it was a Middle Eastern 20 minutes.
It's Middle Eastern 20 minutes, fair enough. Uh, so I want to get into your thoughts on the Trump plan. Before I do that, I want to touch on something which is relevant to the question, which is you mentioned at the end there, Qatar. And Qatar is an interesting actor here because it's what is part of the Gulf. It's not, as we know, one of the Gulf states that is traditionally that we think of as a friend. And I think most Israelis are rightly, in my view, very suspicious of Qatar because of its not just its sponsorship of Hamas, but also Al Jazeera and other things. And yet, as you said, it played a major part in the excuse me, in the success of the plan. And they have good relations with the United States, not just with Trump, but with previous administrations as well. Given your close relationships with the Gulf and other places, I'm interested in what you can tell us about how you see Qatar, its motivations, and to what extent it's been successfully brought into the builders group or not.
So yeah, very important question. I would be very hesitant to call Qatar a builder. It's also not quite a destroyer. So long ago, someone explained to me the best way to understand the Qataris is that they are the firefighter, the arsonist, and the journalist at the scene reporting about both of those. You have to understand who Qatar is and how the Gulf states dynamics work. So the Gulf states, we're talking about 7 states of the GCC, ethnically, linguistically, as far as the actual families, they are very much one and the same as everyone else in the Gulf. So the Saudis, the Bahrainis, the Kuwaitis, the Emiratis, the Omanis are quite a bit different, and they're all basically giant nomadic tribal families with influences from the sea. The modern version of Qatar chose to go on its own. It could have been a part of the UAE. And we're talking about 300,000 actual Qataris. The rest are foreign workers sitting on a pile of cash that makes them basically as rich as God. And their main goal is influence and relevance. And so the new Qatari emir, who actually deposed his father, don't worry, Dad, I'm not going to depose you. Okay. The new Qatari emir deposed his father, if I recall, in the 2000s. His inclinations and the inclinations of the Qatari government are Islamist. Their sympathies are with Hamas, with Muslim Brotherhood, but they are also, at the end of the day, pragmatic. And their main goal is, how does Qatar become an indispensable, absolutely influential actor? Now, what I didn't understand for the last 2 years, and what I was very happy to see now, and one of the big question marks we have is, what will the American administration do? So as we know, the Qataris buy influence. They pay virtually everyone. They bought most of the American academia and the Western academia. They own, if I recall, something like a quarter of London, right, and every major sports club. They buy everything. They figure out what to do with it later. But they're essentially buying defense guarantees. And the reason that they host the largest American air base in the Middle East is so that America protects them. And even though they are Islamist inclined and they know how to talk to the Iranians, they're terrified of the Iranians. And the gas fields that Qatar has are gas fields that are disputed with the Iranians. And so the Qataris, when left to their own devices, will support Islamists, will support Hamas. It helps them that Hamas is there. It helps them that there are Islamist forces, whether military or in the media or in academia, such as Al Jazeera, of course, also, like levers that they can turn up and they can turn down when they need to exert power. So they can turn it up, and then there's a problem that maybe they didn't cause, but they certainly exacerbated, and then they can come to the Americans or the international community and say, well, we can help you with this problem, right? What I was happy to see is that America finally pressured Qatar with a stick and carrot approach. You know, when Israel struck Hamas's leadership in Doha, I was initially quite critical of it. I thought it was foolish and short-sighted. once again, the saying in Israel is, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I thought that that's what was happening. What I might be seeing now, and there are even rumors that Israel might have missed on purpose, was a signal allowed by the Americans, and I have no doubt that America allowed that attack, despite that they denied it, to Qatar, to Turkey, to anyone who harbors Hamas or terrorists, that you are not safe from Israeli strikes, and the Israelis certainly know how to go after anyone, anywhere. You want our protection? It's time to throw Hamas under the bus.
Very interesting. So let's get to some of the nuts and bolts of the Trump plan. I think after the initial, celebration, genuine, like ecstatic celebration here in Israel, the return of the hostages, we're left with a bunch of questions, and one of them, I think, is when we talk about phase 2 of the plan, if and when we get there, which requires Hamas to be demilitarized, disarmed. Do you see that? Do you see the people you talk to in the Arab world, the Gulf states, or other Arab or Muslim countries being involved in that process of disarming Hamas? Because it's hard to imagine, I don't know, Emirati soldiers going into Gaza and disarming Hamas, or whatever, Pakistanis, whatever. How do you see that happening? Is that something that you think could happen?
My wish list was that we would be able to get our troops out, and these Muslim soldiers, these Arab soldiers would go in and confront it. I'm a bit torn on that question, and I want to be intellectually honest here. I think ideally, the only elements that will have the legitimacy to go in and disarm Hamas, because Hamas is not going to do it on its own. Hamas is not going to willingly give up its arms. It's happy to give up the semblance of power. What Hamas would really like is a Hezbollah model, well, Hezbollah until recently model, where it has all the power, all the arms, none of the actual governing responsibilities. That's what Hamas would like. And so you'll notice, by the way, the Hamas sympathizer talking point is, well, Hamas has offered to give up power many, many times. They offered to give up governance, not power. You have a number of Arab and Muslim countries that have experience in militarizing, going after Islamist terrorist groups, and also the next step after that is de-radicalizing. And so it's very hard for me to imagine the Emiratis themselves doing the boots on the ground role. What I can imagine, and this is still a big if, we still have to see if they would be willing to confront actual Hamas fighters in Gaza on the ground. You see what Hamas is doing now in Gaza. They are rounding up and executing dozens of Palestinians who are accused of collaborating with Israel. It is possible. You have had Palestinian, non-Hamas Palestinians training in Egypt. I found out last night also training in Pakistan. The Egyptians and the Pakistanis, and to some extent the Saudis, but especially the Egyptians and the Pakistanis, know how to physically fight and dismantle Islamist terrorist infrastructures. The Emiratis, the Saudis, and again, as I learned from this recent podcast, it should be up tonight. You're welcome to download it. It's called Middle East Breakdown. The Indonesians, who are also mentioned to be a part of this international force, the Pakistanis, and the Malaysians, actually have very good experience in the de-radicalization of Islamic societies and replacing it with very much a moderate version of Islam. And so does that possibility that some kind of concoction force that includes the Pakistanis and the Indonesians, certainly guided by the Emiratis and the Saudis, with Israeli and American intelligence, with other non-Hamas Palestinians on the ground, probably doing the heavy lifting, that's what I can expect to be the most realistic scenario.
Interesting. When you were talking before about the UAE in particular and its reform Islam and the way it's arresting Muslim Brotherhood preachers and imams and other things, I couldn't help but think that they have something to teach Europe about how to deal with these things. Just going back to the Abraham Accords, and as you said, when you talked about the timing of October 7th, that it looked like we were on the cusp of Saudi normalization, which would be, I think, a real game changer in all kinds of ways. And when you look back at what the Saudis were saying, they would often, at that point, they were sort of giving they were kind of soft pedaling the Palestinian issue. So the question as to how normalization could happen without movement towards a Palestinian state was kind of answered by the Saudis saying, we don't really need a Palestinian state, we just need some sort of vague comment by the Israelis in that direction or something. And then as the war went on after October 7th, they hardened their position, and you got more somewhat more kind of pro-Palestinian, if you like, statements coming from the Saudis. Do you think that was kind of bluster, or just something that MBS had to say because of what was going on in Gaza? And do you think the Saudis can be rowed back to basically a position where normalization is more likely despite the absence of movement on the Palestinian issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think you framed it quite nicely here. First of all, something I heard about a month into this war, and then I heard a different version of it recently. Make no mistake, the Arab world, especially chief among them the Saudis, need for us to unequivocally defeat Hamas. For the sake of the Abraham Accords, there's no point in making peace and possibly upsetting your domestic population for peace with the loser. But they also need us to defeat Hamas because the precedent of an Islamic militia overrunning a sovereign state is terrifying to them. And so for their sake, for our sake, for the sake of the Abraham Accords, it is imperative for them that we defeat Hamas, which is, again, why they came out 2 years too late, but they came out and unequivocally blamed Hamas for October 7th, said that Hamas can have no future in the Palestinian arena and Hamas must be disarmed, because that's their biggest nightmare, as was ISIS a decade before. Now, prior to that, when it wasn't really on the radar of everything, I think your characterization was right. What they were saying and what Israeli, largely public and certainly decision makers weren't attuned to was they weren't saying, you're not going to get peace with us until there's a Palestinian state tomorrow in all of Gaza and the West Bank and half of Jerusalem. It's not what they were saying. They were saying we need to see negotiations or discussions that could lead to the possible horizon of a potential possible Palestinian entity that gives a sense of autonomy and somewhat independence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because the war in Gaza, the October 7th attack, and something that shocked me, by the way, it was not televised or covered in Arab social media the way we watched it. If you are an Arab sitting in Riyadh, sitting in Dubai, sitting in Damascus, Beirut, you did not see a tenth of what we saw on social media. You saw primarily and even only the destruction in Gaza, which is real. You saw, of course, the manipulations and the lies and the pictures also pulled from other conflicts that have nothing to do with us. And you saw that on a loop 24/7. And you said, at best, oh, Israel suffered a bad terrorist attack on October 7th, and now something 20 times as bad is happening in Gaza. And the countries, the leaders are attuned to this. And so they cannot, at that time, stand by Israel. And then you had something else troubling happening here, and that you had a number of Israeli politicians who are not actually in power, who are not actually determining war strategy, speaking in terms of, we will expel every last Gazan and turn it into a parking lot. We will drop an atomic bomb on Gaza. There will never be a Palestinian state in the future, et cetera. And you didn't have those who actually are in power, Netanyahu, shutting them up for the sake of a coherent national communication strategy. And so there is no way that the Saudis or any other Arab or Muslim country can make peace with Israel while all of this is happening, while the image of destruction is being broadcast to their constituents, to the world. And of course, keep in mind, who are the Saudis? They're not the Emiratis. They are the custodians of the two holiest sites of Islam. Millions of pilgrims from all over the Muslim world come to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia actually became much more hardline. It's now coming out of it and becoming much more moderate. But after 79, when the Iranians, with the Iranian Revolution, because they tried to make a move to take over Mecca. And so they have to play this game. And the best way that we can play the game with them is to certainly not shut the door to any diplomatic possibilities. That's not how the Arab world works. You always keep the door open. You can brush things, push things down the road, kick the can down the road. What the Trump plan includes, and I'm glad that we were able to accept it, is that it talks about a political horizon. And that was enough to get the Saudis to back it.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting. Before we go to questions from the audience, I wanted to find out more about the new initiative that you're doing, the Middle East 24 media, and this new podcast that you referred to. So maybe you can take.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm giving you the platform to plug your
new
initiative.
So, mind you, on October 7th, a year after October 7th, I'm still the head of an NGO that is working with Arabs, traveling the Arab world, going around the United States and speaking at hundreds of campuses and communities and different events. And it dawned on me, a big part of the reason why, I'll give you the kind of catch-all. Why does the New York Times, CNN, or BBC get Israel wrong so often? All right? You've all asked this question. Okay, why is Israeli Hasbara so bad? Okay, but the flip side is, the short answer is CNN and BBC, New York Times get everything about the Middle East wrong. And so I came together with a number of my friends and colleagues that I had met over the last years, journalists, analysts, scholars, the kind of talking heads you see in the region. Because it turns out, if you go back to the first part of my story, there is a massive growing understanding among serious people in the Middle East of an understanding of this builders and destroyers concept of who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, of the need to shed this revisionism, this radicalism, all the other isms. And we all realized collectively that there is no inverse of Al Jazeera. There's no pro-moderates, pro-West, certainly not a pro-Israel, but there's no, if you are a moderate, liberal, pragmatic, Arab or Muslim intellectual, you have no media home. And so we collectively came together, a number of us, people in Saudi Arabia and in the Gulf, Americans and Europeans of different Middle Eastern origins. And we established this platform called Middle East 24. I urge you, you can find it right now on X, formerly Twitter. You can find it on Instagram. You can find it on YouTube. We're working on finalizing our website. And the idea is to have a truly broad Middle Eastern media content analysis platform. It's not a think tank. It's new media. Everything from round-the-clock news, fast analysis, interviews, podcasts. We launched a podcast called Middle East Breakdown that sometimes I host with a co-host who is a Syrian American, and sometimes I host it myself. Every week is different guests from around the region. And you're going to get a truly regional view, but from this growing notion around the region that is quite sick of the radicalism, of the hijacking of the media by Al Jazeera and others, and the realization that there was no liberal platform in the Middle East.
Great. Okay, so you heard it here. Middle East 24. You can go to X or Instagram or YouTube and check that out. Okay,
and it is a nonprofit initiative. If you want to self-support.
There you go. So we have a bit of time for questions. I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to come and help me with a mic so that we can make sure that not only we hear, but also our audience on Zoom hear the questions. I need to get okay, I see Barbara's hand up, and yeah, and then we'll go down. There's a bunch of people on that row. Okay, let's go down the line. Let's start with Barbara.
I think you're terrific. Thank you very much for sharing all of this with us. I would like you to talk a little bit more about Turkey. I think Turkey is a very big player in the Middle East. I think Turkey wants to create the caliphate maybe more than anyone else does. And I would like you to address that. And I would also like you to address the amount of damage that Qatar has done to the United States and other Western nations by degrading the academic source of pride in those countries. You know, Americans are not proud anymore. They've been taught to be ashamed of their culture, as have other European countries. And I think that set up, I don't want to make a speech, I'm sorry, but I think that if you could address that, because they created a foundation which was waiting to crumble at this point.
So you went for the easy questions. And I think you're terrific too. Thank you. Turkey is an interesting character, and I should have given it more attention in my remarks. So Turkey, since Erdogan's rise, we're talking about the early 2000s, Turkey is a Muslim Brotherhood state, but it is quite different than Hamas, for example. Its Islam is much more, again, I'm going to give the Jewish parable here. It's much more modern Orthodox as opposed to ultra-Orthodox in this sense. And so the religious social dynamic in Turkey is not an extreme version of Islam, but they do hold that as one of their priorities. And everywhere Muslim Brotherhood factions are involved in the broader Middle East, North Africa conflicts, Turkey is there backing the Islamist side. They've been one of the main rhetorical and political backers of Hamas over the last few years. Keep in mind, Turkey, as Muslim Brotherhood, would like to see a resurgence of the caliphate. But remember where the caliphate sat. It sat in Turkey, or modern-day Turkey. And so the better way to understand Turkey is sort of in this, what is called Neo-Ottomanism, and this kind of rise in Neo-Ottoman, that is, can Turkey once again become the dominant power in the broader Middle East and Central Asia region, vying for that power with the Saudis, with Iran, with Israel? But it came at a time at the end of the 2000s when Turkey was rebuffed from joining the EU. And so you had this kind of broad rebuffing and then a turning eastward and southward into the Middle East. Turkey seeks power, Turkey seeks influence. But what was the interesting thing we saw here? Just like the Americans were able to go to the Qataris, who are also Islamist, and say, you want our protection? Say goodbye to Hamas, or at least pressure Hamas, okay? Turkey is the other patron, political patron of Hamas, and a lot of Hamas leaders sit in Turkey. And they went to the Turks and said, you want F-35s? You're going to have to pressure Hamas. And that's exactly what happened. Now, my big thing on Turkey and on Qatar in that sense is you're going to need concerted and constant American and regional pressure on both of them to maintain that pressure on Hamas. That's what was missing for me for the last 2 years. And I believe that was the linchpin to be able to get Hamas, that with the military pressure, the entrance into Gaza City. Now, to your second question of Qatar. Look, we can put a lot of weight on Qatar, and it's essentially buying of academia, lobbying firms. It's the biggest lobbyist up there with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, actually, not APAC, in Washington and in different European capitals. But I think it would do a disservice to put all of this on Qatar. The Qatar's main goal is to make itself look good, okay? Islamism is second. Making itself look good and making sure that nobody is critical of Qatar in any of these forums is their chief priority. One thing I said, I met a group of American philanthropists yesterday, and they asked me a similar question. And one of the key things I said is, you American Jewish philanthropists love to put your names on buildings at universities, while the Qataris are buying the curriculum and the professors. And I don't need the Goldstein, Sciences building that's pushing out Qatari propaganda. Put your own academic chairs in it and start pushing out pro-West, pro-Israel, pro-whatever propaganda. What we need to understand here is there's a deep civilizational war. It's also being pushed heavily by the Russians and by the Chinese and by Iran. It's being pushed by Muslim Brotherhood very, very broadly. Qatar funds Muslim Brotherhood, but it's not the mind. It's the wallet, but not the mind behind Muslim Brotherhood. And it's latching onto a moment that you touched on, and that is a lack of purpose, a lack of cohesion, a weakening of identity, of religious identity, of community in the West, broadly speaking. And I believe as human societies that we ultimately seek community purpose and something that's akin to religion. And this is where communism and Marxism come in, and they know how to prey exactly on those weak points in Western society. That's why their messaging resonates so well with these. But it's not just the messaging, it's not just the ideology, it's not just the fact that a lot of these newspapers and media outlets are pushing the same narrative and reporting on reality in a way that skews people to understand reality in that way. Okay, you have to have people primed to that. And then, of course, you have to have paid agitators on the ground. A lot of these protests we see are not organic protests at all. These are paid agitators being bussed in, flown in, trained in Cuba and other places in order to make it seem as if there's this groundswell. And now we see the devious results of this 20 years later.
Okay. Yeah, you can switch it on.
Dan, the contours of your builders and destroyers concept sounds very, very similar to Ben Shapiro's Lions and Scavengers. First of all, can you tell me, is that indeed the case? Are they indeed very similar? And if they are not, could you tell me how they differ?
I'm familiar with it.
Yeah, you're going to have to explain a little bit about what lines, what Ben Shapiro's thesis is.
Essentially, it's, like I said, it sounds very, very similar. He describes lions as those promoters not only of Western civilization, but those elements within society that are promoting the, positive, constructive changes in society. Yes, he does place it in an American context as opposed to your builders and destroyers. I think that are more within a Middle East context. But again, the two concepts sound very, very similar. So, right.
I'll say I hadn't heard that. From my many years of watching National Geographic, I will say lions are known to be scavengers and hyenas are known to be hunters also as well. If anything of any public intellectual resonated with me, it was actually Douglas Murray's Democracies and Death Cults. I'll say I developed this. He's a much better writer, I guess, because I developed this before, but I just didn't have the momentum to put out the book as well as he did. But that resonates a little more with me. I'm not familiar, but I'm assuming it does. And again, it's this societal impetus to destroy nihilistic tendencies. You see it, by the way, also on the Marxist far left. And you also, the more I read and delve into military history, there have been civilizations over time who wage war because that is the culture and that is the lifestyle they know. They know, the Mongols, for example, or other civilizations that wage war for the sake of waging war because that is what they know, and they don't know how to live a productive lifestyle. They don't know how to have a productive civilization. So I think it's more akin to that. And my chidush, right, my understanding here was that, to myself at least, was that our failure was that we can't even comprehend that kind of mindset because we are so much in a builder mentality and mindset.
I'm wondering about two separate little issues. One is trying to understand the culture that that resulted in the UAE being so much different from somebody like Qatar. If they're the same family and the same nationality and the same, that's number one. And number two, I understand what you mentioned about the fertility of the culture in a country that has lost culture, identity, pride, and religion. But that's good to understand, and with agitators, good to understand the population of the ones in the street. But when the New York Times sits there, you're talking about people with some intelligentsia, some background, some history of journalism, of professional journalism. Is there not something else that makes them fertile for that kind of skewing of ideas? Is it a built-in anti-Semitism? There's something more surprising about that? Al Jazeera would come to them with obviously false things, and they would say, oh, we got to publish that. What's going on there?
Yeah. So again, the easy questions, that's good. So I have to say, you would think the Emiratis are paying me, by the way, they're not. I wish they were. There is something special there, but first of all, the Gulf countries in general are very pragmatic countries. These are countries of societies of traders, Traders, right? These are societies that are incredibly multicultural just by virtue of where they sit. These are countries that for millennia have been the meeting point of people from what is today Iran, what is today Pakistan, India, East Africa, and all over the Middle East meeting in that part of the world to trade. And so their mentality tends to be very open, very laid back, very pragmatic, very much how do we make money. Where do the Qataris stray? I don't know if I can give you a deep enough answer. Again, my understanding is the emir that took over from his father in the 2000s has Islamist inclinations. A lot of people in the Gulf did have Islamist inclinations. The pockets, the funders of radical Islam, of Al-Qaeda, of madrasas around the region were in Saudi Arabia, were in the UAE, were in Qatar for many years. You've had a transformation. I think in the UAE, they have been very fortunate to have been blessed since their foundation with an especially enlightened and pragmatic monarch. And so the concept of multiculturalism, tolerance to other religions, relative fair treatment of women relative to the rest of the Middle East, and tolerance to any other religion is baked into their society. What they had to deal with was how do you clamp down on radical Islamic preachers in the entire system, and how do you rebuild and reconstitute a new moderate Islam that speaks only of family values and virtues and self-improvement, and aggressively avoids anything related to the political, which is what Islamism does. And there's actually a government office that writes the sermons for every single mosque, which is very much a surveillance state. And so they get a script. Every preacher gets a script every Friday. This is the sermon you're going to read. But if you go to the main mosque, their main symbolic mosque, I mean, it's quite in your face. They're not even trying to hide it. There's a moving escalator that takes about 10 minutes because it's massive. And you see pictures not of Muslims praying. You see pictures of interfaith gatherings with big letters: tolerance, peace, pluralism. Right? It's quite in your face what they're trying to inculcate. In 2017, they established a ministry of tolerance, and the other Gulf countries, by certain delays, certainly the Saudis now are looking at it. But you have to be blessed with, one of the dangers of an autocratic, a monarch, is you have to have the good fortune to land on an enlightened dictatorship. And unfortunately, right, it's a Russian roulette, so to speak. To your other question, I think, look, to say anti-Semitism, it's easy, it's also not wrong, okay? I think at the heart of everything we will ever have for in the foreseeable future in the Abrahamic societies, is that underlying resentment of the religion that they were supposed to replace, okay? And Marxism, by the way, also comes out of that, because it's a Western secularized concept of religion and taking Christianity to that next evolution without calling it that, fetishizing the weak in society, so to speak. But what you have in inherently any Christian in any Muslim society is a resentment of the older brother, the older sister who refused to accept the Messiah or the prophet. So we have to contend with the fact that it will always be there. What drives me crazy about the New York Times is how many Jews actually work there or used to work there. And let's not put it past ourselves that some of the greatest anti-Semites in history have always been Jews who internalize the anti-Semitism and said, well, if only we, the Jews, got along with the program, anti-Semitism would end, because that is what is Jewish anti-Semitism, right? So if only we go along with the nationalism or the Marxism or the wokeism or other whatever it is, that's why there's anti-Semitism, obviously, and so it will dissipate and end, and then we can be a holistic society here. I think what you have in places like the New York Times and all of these places, you have this whole ecosystem of people who have gone to the universities where they were, the Columbias and the Northwesterns and others, where they were radicalized by Qatari-bought professors and by Marxist professors who started in a very coordinated plan to infiltrate Western academia in America in the 1970s, in Western Europe in the 1950s and 60s, came out literally out of the Soviet Union. And so you have this ecosystem of academics and intellectuals taking over the academic space today, and there's someone behind you in the crowd who can speak to that from a personal perspective, perhaps, of not finding a place of being a conservative in American academia. And if all the Middle East news you're getting is from the Middle East, and it's either state propaganda or Islamist propaganda, and you're already primed to it, and you want to feel like you're on the right side of history, and your entire information loop is telling you genocide, human rights abuser, et cetera. So when that story comes across your desk, you're not going to question it as much as you should. And I think that's a slightly short answer to a very complicated question.
Okay, yes. Front row. Yeah. Just speak into it, I think.
Yeah, okay.
There you go, we can hear you.
For a question which is something maybe different, do you have any idea of a time frame for the Trump initiative, the 20-point initiative? And also, will it outlive Trump? Will it outlive Trump?
You mean outlive his administration?
Yes.
Very good. Time frame. Hard to say. It's gonna depend on implementation here. And this is both the reason why everyone was able to agree to it, and also the reason why it's gonna be tricky to implement. What are you talking about here, right? We've passed the first stage. We have, thankfully, all the living hostages back. We will, I believe, get at least most of the deceased hostages back. We pulled out to the yellow line, which is within the Gaza Strip, but outside. That's where we are now, and they received their prisoners back, right? So stage one is done. It's actually a different agreement, because that they were willing to agree to more or less from the beginning. Stage two is where it gets tricky. So you're talking about bringing in an interim force that we discussed earlier. You're talking about bringing in an interim government backed by possibly Tony Blair, that oversees a reformed Palestinian governance that takes over Gaza. That's going to be very hard to do if you still have Hamas. So I think the first stage has to be disarmament. And Hamas is not going to, some Hamas members, one of the previous podcasts we did was with quite a well-known Gazan analyst, activist, and he said, a lot of the people who we call Hamas are ideologically Hamas. Some of them are just thugs who will go wherever they're paid or because they received food. And some of them, maybe had to be there to survive, but are not necessarily Hamas, and they can be bought out. Unfortunately, that's the reality with militias and mercenaries in the Middle East. So I don't know to say, will there be some people who are armed called Hamas who are willing to give up their arms in exchange for some kind of clemency? Possibly. Will Israel have to go in and physically disarm and fight with Trump's backing? I'm going to not get to your second question yet. Or will these international troops actually go in and confront and try to disarm Hamas? The other option, so that's a big if, and it's a big if and it's a big when that could happen. The other alternative, however, is something we're seeing, in that there are areas of Gaza that have been cleared from Hamas that are in the hands of non-Hamas militias who are willing and are already fighting Hamas. These are not good guys, by the way. These are not pro-Israel people. So we have to be very careful. We're talking about the Abu Shabaab gangs and others. These are criminal gangs. These are mafias, but at least they're our criminal gangs for now. And that's always volatile when you're dealing with these kinds of issues. So I think the timeline depends on the implementation, and will these, is it foreign troops backing other Palestinians? Will they actually be willing to confront? And you know, it could be months, it could be years, or you could see at the same time, or alternatively, these pockets of non-Hamas areas actually demilitarize, de-radicalize, and then begin to implement this new alternative Palestinian vision. And there, it is very possible that you'll have an internal Palestinian dynamic that will prefer what they see in certain enclaves over the others. But these are a lot of big ifs. Your second question, I think, is a very important one, because I think it'll have to depend on who the next administration is in the United States. My fear and my sense is that Joe Biden may have been the last, for now, openly pro-Israel US president, Democrat. There's also trend lines on the right of sort of the J.D. Vance, really America firsts, who are not necessarily pro-Israel in any kind of way, right? And we have to be careful that Democrat or Republican doesn't mean pro-Israel. Right now it does, but going forward and going backwards, it doesn't necessarily mean that. And you know, going back, also connecting to the New York Times and anti-Semitism and other questions here, there's a bigger question in play here. And it's not just, are you pro-Israel or anti-Israel? It's, do you have a clear understanding of what's actually happening in the Middle East and world affairs? Do you have a belief in American leadership, in American exceptionalism? And I think these are the bigger issues that are tied to that. I am quite concerned about what comes next in the United States. I had a conversation off the record with the former, called strategic communications advisor in the Biden White House, and or one of them, I should say. And there is a lot of concern over who the next generation of staffers and advisors are in a Democratic administration. There's a lot of concern.
Okay. Do we have,
just talk very quickly?
Yeah, so let's make, this will be the last question?
Yeah.
Okay. Make it a good one. No pressure.
Okay, you touched on what's happening in the U.S., and it seems that all the liberal democratic countries, like Canada, where we're from, England, France, disaster, but all of those countries immediately came out with supporting Palestinian statehood. The only friends we seem to have, I mean, Germany has stayed fairly steady, and like Hungary and the more conservative right wing, which is totally opposite to how we grew. Now, the worry that worries me is it seems like the younger generations in these countries are, whether they're being influenced by social media, which I think is a huge issue, but what is the future, not only for Jews in Israel, but for, like, other than Florida, I don't see any place really where you know, I mean, where Jews are welcome and wanted, especially in liberal democracies.
Yeah, we have a major, so there's two elements to that question, and they are connected. First of all, there's two elements to that, and one is progressive governments right now in the West, in Canada, Australia, UK, most of Western Europe, took a pro-Palestinian line. First of all, I think, you know, there was a bit of a silver lining in all of their statements, which I, you know, wrote an article, I interviewed ad nauseum, including on UK TV, quite a bit about it. You know, in the you know, the subtext of their unbelievably naive statements, saying that they were going to recognize a Palestinian state, Israel has to allow aid in, et cetera, and then they tied it very clumsily to what's happening in Judea and Samaria, which may or may not be problematic, but has nothing to do with what's happening in Gaza. They did say, and Hamas, of course, can have no part of the state, and Hamas must be demilitarized, right? So for the meantime, they understand, they want to be pro-Palestinian, but keep in mind who their constituents are. It's not just young people. These are countries with massive Muslim immigrant populations. And I have a very strong sense that their statements, which have zero practical implications, were meant more to appease their domestic audiences, their voters, because where it didn't happen, as you said, the countries, Germany is, by the way, the exception for many, many reasons here. But the countries that did not make such statements and pushed back against it, and the ones that are in some part moving their embassies to Jerusalem and doubling down, are those that have conservative governments. So first of all, Hungary, Poland, Czech, etc., these are countries that also almost entirely didn't let in Muslim immigration. Italy, you have a right-wing government. They've been staunchly pro-Israel despite the protests, etc. And something interesting that you're seeing in a lot of these countries is a pushback against this. You saw in the UK, of course, the 3 million-ish person march, and of course, the organizer of that, Tommy Robinson, is here in Israel right now. Not quite sure how to feel about that. But you're seeing a pushback. And what we need to be careful of, however, is the pendulum can swing the other way. And I am seeing this. I'm deep in social media every day. If you only woke up and turned on, especially Twitter, X, and read the discourse on Israel, you would become immediately anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-West, if you didn't really know how to differentiate reality from what you read. And you've been inundated, young people have been inundated by this from the left and from the Arab and Muslim world. By the way, a lot of these are Iranian and Hamas and Turkish and Chinese and Russian bots and avatars. About 20%, 25% are not real. However, you're starting to see a worrying trend coming from the right, where it's taking strong nationalism and a Christian nationalism in which Jews don't have a part. And so Jews have always been comfortable where the center dominates, center left, center right, it doesn't matter. We have to be careful not to tie ourselves entirely to one side or another. And where is it safe to be a Jew? Unfortunately, that's the Jewish story, is you have ups and downs. Right before we came on here, I saw, again, connecting back to the New York thing. Right now, 12% of New York is Jewish. At different points in New York's history, a quarter or a third of New York was Jewish. And, you have a lot of New York Jews supporting Mamdani. And people saying, well, no way that New York can turn on its Jews. Well, guess what? Warsaw used to be 40% Jewish at one point. Baghdad used to be a third Jewish at one point, maybe even half Jewish. How many major cities and civilizations were, what? Minsk, yeah. How many major cities and civilizations had massive Jewish populations that were the middle class, the intelligentsia, the lawyers, the professors, the actors, etc., who are now cleansed or almost entirely cleansed of their Jews? It's a warning. I think by and large, American Jewry is strong. I think American Jewry needs to fight back big time. I think one of the big things that's missed is that this is not about the Jews. This is a civilizational battle. And because it's easy to go to anti-Semitism from any direction you come at, Christian, Muslim, far left, far right, it all comes center at Jews. We have to remember this isn't about us. We have to galvanize as big a civilizational coalition as possible and remind people that the fate of society is at stake here. And it's not just whether the Jews in a given city feel comfortable or not. And we keep having to remind people about that. And unfortunately also realize that that is the arc of history. Right now, Israel is the center of world Jewry. America is still the second most populous, certainly one of the most powerful. Everywhere else is in decline. You will have ups, you will have downs, and unfortunately, that is the arc of Jewish civilization.
Okay, thank you very much, Dan Feferman. Thank you for your wonderful presentation and really giving us a lot to think about, and I think a really fantastic thesis at a time when we all need as many tools as we can to unpick the complexities of what we're dealing with in the Middle East. You're doing amazing work. I recommend everyone check out Dan's new initiative, Mideast 24, and we will hopefully see you here again soon for another presentation. Thank you, everyone. We'll be back here for those of you in Jerusalem We have a movie screening next week on Tuesday, I believe, a movie called Resilience with an American filmmaker who's made an amazing documentary film about people who survived October 7th and were dealing with post-traumatic stress and other things, and that whole story. And she interviewed a lot of both survivors and also experts on that. So that should be an amazing watch as well. That's next Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a great evening. Bye.